It started as just another press briefing, another back and forth between the White House and the media. But when Karoline Leavitt went on the attack, calling a New York Times reporter a left-wing stenographer, she ignited a battle far bigger than she expected. Overnight, she became the face of a war between the press and the administration, drawing both praise and condemnation. As the controversy deepened, the real stakes emerged. Was this just another media spat, or was something bigger happening behind the scenes? This is the story of a political gamble, the enemies it created, and the consequences no one saw coming. The briefing room was tense before she even stepped inside. The cameras were already rolling, the reporters seated, their notepads ready to catch every word. The daily press briefing had become more than just a routine event. It was a spectacle, a battlefield where the administration and the media clashed over narratives, policies, and the never-ending game of control. For Karoline Leavitt, the stakes were always high. As the White House press secretary, her job wasn't just to deliver information. It was to shape perception, to deflect, to counterattack when necessary. And lately, it had been necessary more often than not. The administration was under fire from all angles. Poll numbers were fluctuating. Congress was gridlocked. The opposition had found new talking points to hammer home, and the press was relentless in their pursuit of headlines that would stick. It was in moments like these that Leavitt had to be at her sharpest, her most aggressive. She had studied the pattern. The press corps had its favorite players, those who asked the expected questions, those who were given the space to set the tone for the entire briefing. And then there were the disruptors, the ones who framed their questions like weapons, designed not just to elicit answers, but to create controversy. The New York Times had one of those disruptors. The reporter had been circling the same issue for weeks, picking apart inconsistencies, calling out deflections. His questions weren't about policy anymore. They were about undermining credibility, about pushing her, about making her slip. It was a game, and he knew how to play it well. When the question came, it was unexpected, but it was designed to land like a punch. The room waited. The cameras zoomed in. Leavitt's response was swift, sharp, and decisive. She didn't just answer. She attacked. She framed the journalist's question as a loaded narrative. She dismissed his reporting as agenda-driven. And then she delivered the line that would explode across the media world within hours. She called him a left-wing stenographer. The room reacted immediately. Some reporters shifted uncomfortably. Others took notes faster, knowing that this was the moment they would be writing about. It wasn't just a press briefing anymore. It was a declaration of war. The fallout was immediate. Within minutes, clips of her remark flooded social media. News networks cut into their broadcasts, dissecting the moment from every angle. Some praised her for calling out media bias. Others condemned her for attacking a journalist in such direct terms. The White House phones lit up. Some calls came from supporters who saw it as a necessary fight, a pushback against an industry they believed was stacked against them. Others came from political strategists, warning that she had crossed a line, that she had turned a difficult relationship into an outright war. And then there was the response from the Times itself. The newspaper didn't just report on the incident. It framed it as an attack on journalism itself. Op-eds poured in, condemning the administration for its hostility toward the press. Media organizations rallied around their own. The press briefing room, already a place of tension, had become something else entirely. Leavitt had been in political battles before. She had handled controversies, weathered media storms. But this time, something was different. This time, it felt personal. The journalist she had called out wasn't backing down. Instead, he was going after her harder than ever. His next piece wasn't just about the administration's policies. It was about her history, her tactics, her role in shaping narratives that, according to him, distorted the truth. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just controlling the story. She was the story. And in Washington, being the story was dangerous. The following days were a blur of damage control and counterattacks. Inside the White House, opinions were divided. Some advisors saw the feud as a net positive, a rallying point for the administration's base. Others worried that it was a distraction, a losing battle that would only escalate further. Leavitt herself remained composed, at least outwardly. But behind the scenes, she was calculating. She knew that she couldn't afford to look weak. That if she backed down now, she would lose credibility, not just with the press, but with the administration itself. But she also knew that escalation came with risks. If she pushed too hard, the Times and its allies wouldn't just attack her in editorials. They would dig deeper, look for vulnerabilities. And in Washington, everyone had vulnerabilities. So, she made a decision. She wouldn't apologize, but she wouldn't escalate recklessly either. She would control the pace of the fight. She would dictate the terms. And she would find out who, if anyone, was waiting for her to make a mistake. Because in a battle like this, it was never just about the press. It was about power. And Karoline Leavitt wasn't about to give hers up. Karoline Leavitt had spent years in Washington, but the battle she had stepped into now was unlike any before. The press was an opponent she had always expected to spar with. Attacks from journalists, exaggerated headlines, and hostile interviews were all part of the job. But this time, the fight wasn't just about what she had said at the podium. This time, the battlefield was shifting beneath her feet. The fallout from her remark about the New York Times had been swift. But the real threat wasn't coming from the press. It was coming from within. The administration had grown uneasy. Publicly, they defended her, issuing the usual statements about how the media had been unfair, how she was simply calling out bias. But behind closed doors, she could feel it, the slow turn, the whispered conversations in the West Wing, the careful avoidance of her name in key strategy meetings. Washington had a way of making people disappear without actually removing them. The signs were subtle. Fewer phone calls, less inclusion in key decisions, a slow erosion of influence. She wasn't just fighting the press anymore. She was fighting to keep her place in the administration. The first sign of real trouble came from an unexpected place, inside her own press team. A leaked internal memo surfaced in the media, a carefully worded critique that suggested her approach to handling the media had become too aggressive, potentially damaging the administration's broader communication strategy. It wasn't just an opinion. It was a signal. Someone wanted her out. The memo was anonymous, attributed to senior officials, Washington's favorite way of attacking without taking responsibility. But she knew how these things worked. This wasn't about concern for strategy. This was about power. There were people inside the administration who had never liked her, who had resented her rapid rise, her close ties to the president, her ability to control the narrative. And now, they saw an opportunity to weaken her. She had always been a fighter, but this time, she wasn't sure who all her enemies were, and that made them dangerous. She needed to move carefully. Washington was a place where silence was often more powerful than words. She had learned that lesson early. Sometimes, the most effective response wasn't an attack, but simply waiting for your enemies to expose themselves. The leaked memo had come from someone close enough to the communications team to have access to internal discussions. That meant there was a traitor in her midst. She started paying closer attention, watching for small shifts in behavior, changes in tone. She had spent years reading people, knowing when someone was withholding information. And soon, she found her first lead. An aide, someone relatively new, but ambitious, the type who always seemed eager to be in the right rooms at the right time. She started testing him, giving him small pieces of controlled information, waiting to see where they would surface. It didn't take long. Within 48 hours, one of her carefully planted phrases appeared, almost word for word, in a political gossip column. She had her leak, but finding him wasn't enough. She needed to know who he was working with, because there was no way a junior aide had orchestrated this on his own. Someone higher up wanted her gone. Meanwhile, the New York Times wasn't letting the story fade. They doubled down, releasing a series of articles framing her remark as part of a broader issue, a disturbing pattern of hostility toward the press, a calculated effort to delegitimize journalism itself. The fight wasn't about that one briefing room moment anymore. It had become something larger. It was about narrative, and that was a war Karoline Leavitt knew how to fight. She used the administration's media allies to strike back. Columnists on the right started pushing a counter-narrative, accusing the New York Times of manufacturing outrage, of trying to silence conservative voices. The headlines changed. The conversation shifted, but she could feel the pressure growing. She wasn't just making enemies in the media. She was making enemies in places she couldn't afford to. The second leak came a week later. This one wasn't about messaging. It was about her past. A resurfaced campaign finance report from her congressional run. The numbers weren't new, but the framing was. The article suggested that there were unanswered questions about how her campaign handled certain contributions. Nothing illegal, nothing definitive, but the suggestion alone was enough to do damage. And it wasn't an accident. Someone inside the administration had gone looking for something to use against her. She was being set up for a fall. She wasn't just fighting a press feud anymore. She was fighting for survival. The Washington power game had never been about honesty. It wasn't about who was right or wrong, who had the best arguments or the sharpest wit. It was about leverage, about survival. Karoline Leavitt had always understood that. But now, she wasn't just fighting reporters or political rivals. She was fighting a battle she couldn't see, one that was happening behind closed doors, in whispered conversations, in carefully placed leaks designed to dismantle her career piece by piece. She wasn't just a press secretary anymore. She was a target. The campaign finance scandal hadn't been random. She saw that immediately. The numbers had been public for years, but suddenly they were everywhere. On primetime news segments, in social media threads, in carefully worded opinion pieces that didn't outright accuse her of wrongdoing, but suggested enough to make people question. The timing was deliberate. Someone had been waiting for the right moment to strike. It wasn't about taking her down overnight. It was about weakening her, making her a liability to the administration, making it easier for the right people to push her out when the time came. Inside the White House, the shift was almost imperceptible, but she felt it. Meetings she had once been invited to without question now required an official request. Briefings she used to lead now had additional advisors sitting in. The president's inner circle, once accessible, had started closing its doors. It was a slow political death, not a firing, not a scandal big enough to force a resignation, just a gradual erosion of relevance. She had seen it happen to others, and she knew exactly how it ended. But she wasn't ready to disappear. She needed to fight back, not with public statements, not with an all-out war that would only make her seem desperate. She needed to be smarter. She needed to find the people pulling the strings. The leak about her campaign finances had been planted. She was sure of it, and she already had a suspect. The junior aide she had been watching, the one who had leaked her test phrase, was too ambitious, too connected for someone in his position. He had a mentor, someone feeding him information, someone helping him make moves beyond his rank. She started following the trail. Washington was full of people who talked too much after 2 drinks. She used that to her advantage. A quiet dinner with a trusted ally. A few well-placed questions. A passing remark that seemed meaningless at the time. And then the name surfaced. Not in a direct accusation, not in an obvious way, but in a slip. One of those small details people don't think twice about sharing. The junior aide had been meeting regularly with someone higher up in the communications team. Someone who had access to her files. Someone with a reason to push her out. A rival, not outside the administration, but inside it. Someone who wanted her job. The realization changed everything. This wasn't just about controlling the press narrative anymore. This was about survival in the administration itself. She had 2 options. Expose the plot, go public with what she knew, turn it into another headline. White House power struggle explodes behind the scenes. Or handle it quietly. Washington didn't reward those who cried foul. It rewarded those who knew how to win without making a mess. She had a choice to make, and she was running out of time. Washington was full of predictable players, but the most dangerous ones were those who knew how to rewrite the rules. Karoline Leavitt had spent years studying power, watching how scandals were born, how careers were destroyed, how people were quietly erased from history when they became inconvenient. She wasn't about to let that happen to her. But what she didn't know yet, what no one saw coming, was that she wasn't the only one playing the game. Someone else had set the board, and she was walking straight into their trap. She had a name now, the rival inside the administration, The person who had been working behind the scenes to push her out, planting leaks, stirring the campaign finance story back to life, feeding the media the exact narrative they needed. It was a senior figure in the communications team, someone with just enough power to manipulate the press, but not enough to act alone. That meant there was someone even higher up, someone backing them. This wasn't just an internal rivalry. It was a coup. She needed to move carefully. A direct confrontation wouldn't work. If she made accusations without evidence, it would only make her look paranoid, like she was unraveling under the pressure. That was exactly what her enemies wanted. She had to be strategic. She had to make them expose themselves. So she laid a trap. The setup was simple. A carefully crafted leak, false information, planted where she knew it would reach the right ears. She made it subtle, a quiet change in scheduling, a casual remark about an upcoming personnel announcement that didn't exist, a hint that she was about to receive an internal promotion rather than being pushed out. And then she waited. If her rival was truly trying to remove her, they wouldn't be able to resist acting on the information. And within 48 hours, they did. The unexpected part wasn't that they took the bait. It was how far they went with it. Her fake promotion news didn't just circulate within the administration. It hit the press. A headline appeared, anonymously sourced, of course, suggesting that Karoline Leavitt was being considered for an expanded role in the West Wing. That wasn't the unexpected part. What shocked her was the response. Within an hour of the story breaking, multiple anonymous officials pushed back hard. Statements were issued. Sources close to the president emphatically denied the claim. And then came the internal response. Not a quiet correction. A full-scale shutdown. Meetings were called. Emails circulated. The administration was suddenly treating her as a problem. Her fake story had triggered something bigger than she expected. This wasn't just about removing her. It was about making sure she couldn't fight back. Someone had been waiting for an opportunity to turn the White House against her. And she had just given it to them. The pressure escalated fast. The Ethics Committee suddenly announced it was re-examining her campaign finances. New leaks appeared. This time, rumors about internal concerns over her ability to represent the administration effectively. It wasn't just an attack anymore. It was an execution. Someone had been waiting for her to make a move. Any move. And the second she did, they struck. That's when she realized the truth. She had been so focused on who was behind the attacks that she never asked the more important question. Why? Why had this started now? Why was the effort to remove her so organized? Why had the administration reacted so aggressively to a minor leak? And then she saw it, the story buried beneath the other headlines. Something barely mentioned in the press. A classified policy initiative, one that had been in development for months. Something that required public trust. Something that required absolute message control. And she was the one person standing in the way. She wasn't just being removed because of internal politics. She was being silenced. Washington was ruthless. The game had always been about control. Who had it, who lost it, and who never even realized they were being played. Karoline Leavitt had thought she was fighting a standard political power struggle, an internal coup within the administration designed to push her out. But now she understood. This wasn't just about her. This was about something much bigger. And she was running out of time. The perfectly orchestrated fall. The storm against her was accelerating. It wasn't just leaks anymore. It was coordinated. One moment, she was merely fending off a scandal about her campaign finances, a tired talking point that should have died after a few news cycles. But now, new accusations had emerged, ones that painted a different picture. A high-level official had given an anonymous quote to a national news outlet, suggesting concerns about her management style. Then came the second hit. A closed-door meeting she had attended was now being framed as a critical misstep. She had allegedly overstepped, giving directives outside of her authority. Then the third. An ethics review had been launched. Not a real one. Just an internal memo circulated with carefully crafted language, meant to suggest impropriety without directly accusing her of anything. These weren't separate attacks. This was a structured dismantling. The final, unspoken phase before Washington erased her completely. The unmarked email. She knew it was over before she even opened the email. The subject line was chilling in its simplicity. Look deeper. There was no sender. The domain was an encrypted relay, the kind of email that didn't officially exist. Inside was a single attachment, a classified document, stamped with the highest levels of clearance. Her breath caught as she hesitated. Opening a classified document without authorization wasn't just dangerous, it was career-ending. If this was a trap, she had already lost. But then again, wasn't that the point? They had already decided her fate. What did she have left to lose? She clicked, and then she saw it. The real scandal. The document wasn't about her. It wasn't about her finances, her press briefings, or even the war with the New York Times. It was bigger. It detailed a media control operation, a deep strategic initiative aimed at shaping public perception through carefully placed narratives, controlled leaks, and manufactured crises. The press wasn't exposing the administration. The administration was manipulating the press. There were pre-approved journalists, those who were quietly given first access to key leaks, nudged in the right direction, fed just enough scandal to make them believe they were uncovering real corruption. And there were targets, officials who were deemed expendable, those whose removal served a greater purpose, people like her. Her feud with the New York Times hadn't just been a public relations mess. It had interrupted the process. She had drawn too much attention to how the media operated. She had made people question the press, not just its bias, but its role in shaping events rather than reporting them. And for the architects of the initiative, that made her a liability. The moment of clarity. She sat in stunned silence, her mind racing. This wasn't just a communication strategy. It was an operation, designed to control who got to tell the story, designed to bury certain scandals while amplifying others, designed to destroy people, quietly, efficiently, without ever getting blood on anyone's hands. And she had unknowingly walked right into it. She had assumed she was playing the usual game, a battle between rivals, a fight for power within the administration. But she had been wrong. Her removal wasn't just about internal politics. It was about making sure she didn't speak. She wasn't just being pushed out. She was being silenced. The decision. For the first time in her career, Karoline Leavitt felt something she hadn't felt before. Not anger, not fear, not even desperation. She felt choice. She had two paths in front of her. Path one, she could walk away, accept her fate, let them write the ending for her. They would allow her a soft exit, a graceful resignation framed as her decision to pursue other opportunities. She wouldn't be humiliated. She wouldn't be charged. She wouldn't be destroyed. She would simply disappear. Or, path two, she could fight back. She could expose everything. Not just the campaign finance allegations. Not just the press war. The entire system. She could leak the classified document, break the story herself, dismantle the carefully controlled machine that had been running right under the public's nose. It wouldn't just take down her enemies. It would take down everything, including herself. The last press briefing. The next morning, she walked into the press briefing room as if nothing had changed. The cameras were rolling. The reporters were waiting. But this time, something was different. The senior officials who had been pushing her out were there, watching her closely. The journalists who had built their headlines around her were expecting her downfall. Everyone in that room thought they knew how this was going to end. They thought she would deliver her final, humiliating briefing before resigning. They thought the narrative had already been written, but she hadn't made her choice yet. And that's what made this moment so dangerous. The final move. She looked out across the room, her hands steady, her breath slow. And then she did something no one expected. She paused, long enough for everyone to feel the weight of the silence, long enough for the tension to become unbearable. And then she smiled, a slow, knowing smile, a smile that said, "I know exactly what you did," a smile that said, "I'm not afraid of you." The room shifted. The reporters leaned forward. The officials stiffened. Everyone could feel it. Something was wrong. She hadn't collapsed. She hadn't broken. She was about to do something none of them expected. And in that moment, Karoline Leavitt knew the real story hadn't even begun yet. What happened next? Did she expose the classified document? Did she leak it to the press? Did she cut a deal in exchange for silence? Did she vanish quietly? Or did she burn the entire system down? The cameras were rolling. The stage was set, and only Karoline knew how this story would end.